Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today here on Everyday Lutheran as we continue our study of the book of Romans, studying chapters 13 through chapter 15. In chapter 13, Paul begins talking about the governing authorities. So Paul goes from the smaller Christian community and is expanding what it means to be part of the larger community. Paul makes it clear that the government has been put in place by God to do the work of caring, protecting, and enforcing the law of the land. Now, this idea and concept is one that gets distorted throughout the ages after Paul speaks of it. Paul highlights the importance of having a government in order that safety and security for the people can be upheld. This protection is supposed to be from external forces and internal forces that may want to remove the government. Now, there were leaders, and especially kings, who used this language in order to declare their sovereignty and blessing of God. This would lead to leaders having a coronation services that were presided over by church leaders. Now, this means that the people should obey the laws and care for others around them based upon the laws that are in place within the land. However, this also put the leaders to focus their attention and purpose on the care of the people. The leaders would be consumed by the power that they held and thus would be led by their own interests. This then is no longer the government that God would have placed into authority, and the government would need to change their ways. Yet no one is above the law of the land. Even the highest officials should be held accountable or to higher standards in order that the people may have an example. The leader is a servant of the people. As a servant of the people, they are asked to bring forth the sword against those who go against the law. Paul goes into the payment of taxes. Taxes have always been a source of struggle for people, feeling that they are too much and that the programs and dollars are not going to help them or those who they see as are in need. Yet Paul expands this idea and goes beyond the point of paying taxes for the services of those who are serving in the government, but to also show them respect and honor when it is due to a person. Paul is wanting the people to realize that the people who are serving in those roles are people and child of God. Next, Paul transitioned in verse 8 of chapter 13, delivering words of guidance in short phrases to the people to know. You should not owe anyone anything. You should not be indebted to others so that you are not being controlled or influenced by someone. However, Paul notes that you should show everyone love. This is what God has given to you, love. Thus, you are called to share that love with all who you encounter. This love is the very foundation of trust and respect within the community, so that the whole community may continue. Now, by loving others around you, you are fulfilling the law. Now, even these simple phrases by Paul have been questioned. What should we do if a law is against us as a people or against the practice of our faith? These and similar questions have been raised in many nations and times. There are times in which the leaders are wrong on their actions and understanding. And there are times in which the people of the nation are wrong in their action and understanding. Paul draws the reader from Rome back to the very law that God has given to the Jewish people in the Ten Commandments. These are laws that have been used for thousands of years, yet they can be summarized and fulfilled in one word: love. This love of your neighbor as yourself, as you have and others think of, as the person's perspective, and regard them not as competition, but as a gift from God. You both then strive together for the betterment of one another. You respect and honor one another, and that grows through this love that God has given to you both. Paul, in his understanding of God's work in the world, thought too that the time of salvation for the people was close at hand. Paul, knowing that Christ was in the world, figured that the darkness of the night and the evil was coming to an end, so that we should begin preparing ourselves for the gift of Christ himself, as he has promised to us. So we should be focused on godly things in this world, our community, and our own life. For soon the fullness of God would be upon us all. Now, even these final words of Paul have been distorted in understanding of when and how we should be preparing for God's arrival in the world, the haste in which we should be prepared. Now, since it did not happen as Paul claimed, others have wondered, will it ever happen? However, we shall not know the day or the hour of Christ's return. All we can do is prepare ourselves every single day by living in the promises of our baptism, the gift of Christ in communion, and be a disciple of Jesus Christ every single moment. Paul starts off in chapter 14 that we should strive to welcome people, all people, but especially when it comes from those who are weak in their faith. But not for the purpose of quarreling, but rather as a means of actually reaching out to others and helping them in their understanding of who they are, where they are, where God is at in their life, and who God is in their life. Now, we are human creatures, and one of our greatest flaws has been that we jump to conclusions and judgments. Now, this has helped us in making decisions and ensuring that we are moving forward along with, quite possibly, out of dangerous situations. Paul, though, is drawing us to the divisions that we have created and sustained that are not helpful. Paul, though, is drawing us into the divisions that we have created and sustained that are not helpful and do not build up the kingdom of God in the world. We need to first identify how God has moved in this person's life. For if God has brought this person to you to grow in their faith and through this difficult situation, and your first reaction should not be to point out how great you are. You are not the focus of everyone else. Yet now, Paul is calling us to be aware of how we are caring for one another. So we should not pass judgment on someone else, but rather approach them. For it is before God that they will have to stand and be judged. It's not your place to take this role. Now, Paul goes on in his teaching that every single day when we live, there are people who will look upon that day and say, well, it's just like every other day. However, instead, what if we looked at each day as a gift, filled with opportunities and blessings from God? Now, this would be something that we would look forward to and treasure. We would regard the people and moments that we share as something that we should view as a gift of God, that they truly are. Not only this, but in the same way, meals that we share, and even those who are abstaining from eating, they should not be mocked as weak, but regard them as sustaining, as a glory and honor of God. Now, for this example, even the very life that we live, our life is a gift given to us by God. However, whether we are living or dying, we live for God and we die to God. So no matter what, we are God's. Christ does this work for us so that there's no way that we can change or adjust that work, but it is something that we need to have echo in our life and share with others around us. Now, Paul continues in chapter 14:13 by continuing the same thought as before and drawing it even closer to an understanding of what it means in your faith. Instead of passing judgment against others, we should strive to build others up. We should not be a stumbling block or hindrance to others. God certainly has created all things and declared them to be good. So there is not anything that is unclean. Yet when a person is being distracted or injured by what we are eating, drinking, or doing, then we should recognize that we are not striving for God's love. When Paul is speaking of these things, Paul is addressing the dietary laws and other aspects of faith as things that can detour people from actually recognizing God and God's calling in their life. We should always keep at the forefront the very goal of loving and caring for people. Now, once we have accomplished that and are not being held back by other distractions, then we should discern other ways that we can allow ourselves to be drawn closer to God. However, these practices that are our own should not become others have to or must do. Rather, they are to enhance your relationship with God. Now, once again, it is not about the work that we are doing, but rather about the work that God has done for us. As we focus on what God has done for us, then we should never adjust that message with our own additions, changes, or even our own desires. For we strive for uprightness and peace. Well, this uprightness and peace should also be understood. The uprightness is not our own glory and honor, but rather what is good for others to know the message of God's love found in Jesus Christ. An uprightness of serving one another as Christ has served us. Well, this ties us in with the peace. For if we trust and share in love and compassion for one another, then we truly find peace, God's peace, of knowing that God shall provide and care for us, as we have for one another. To be generous with those who are in need, to recognize the love, care, and calling in the lives of others, then we recognize a person can begin to explore themselves of how God is moving and active in their own life. It's in chapter 15. Paul continues to emphasize this as well. For many of us, we've achieved so much on the focus of our own accomplishments, rather than building up those who shall follow after them. For what happens when someone leaves and there's no one there to replace them, to follow in their teaching, their ideas, or their culture? Everything changes and goes in a completely new direction, a direction that may lead them away from God. So Paul notes that we should be striving for the purpose of building up those around us. Just as Christ came into the world for our sake and not his own, we should be striving for that example as well. Now, this does something else as well. As you are working together as a community to share the love of God, more and more people are able to hear the same message more deeply, more completely. And as they do, they begin to recognize how they themselves are a part of that love. This leads Paul, continuing the message in verse 7, that the gospel is for Jews and Gentiles. There's no separation in God's love and eyes, but only in our own making. Paul draws on Psalm 18 and the prophet Isaiah to show the people how God has spoken these words in their own leaders of past and the prophets of old. Yet Paul goes even further, to have the people listen and trust that the Holy Spirit would guide them and all would be drawn closer to God. Now, throughout these chapters, Paul speaks to us as guiding principles and ways in which we have been thinking that we can lead us astray from God's calling, but also build up others in this world. Yet this is something that we are constantly struggling in within our own lives. We know what it is we should do, but then we fall into old habits and ways of thinking that have gotten us to where we are. Paul is wanting us to examine who is governing our own self and sense of purpose in our order to move us forward for God's greater kingdom. Well, thank you so much for joining me today here on Everyday Lutheran. Join us next time as we continue our study of the book of Romans, focusing on the very end, Paul's plan and closure, chapters 15 through 16.